Unsiloed podcast is produced by University FM, elevating the stories of your institution.
Welcome to Unsiloed. This is Greg LeBlanc, and I'm here today with Geoffrey West, who is a distinguished professor at the Santa Fe Institute and also the author of this book I have with me. It's called Scale: The Universal Laws of Growth, Innovation, Sustainability, and the Pace of Life in Organisms, Cities, Economies, and Companies. Wow, that's a lot to chew off in a book. And it says, I mean, the book is really an attempt to draw together the sciences of biology, or the biological sciences, and the social sciences. And here we have a physicist that's the one that's doing this. And I guess, I mean, this is the kind of thing that this stuff happens all the time, I guess, out there at the Santa Fe Institute, where you are, I guess, crossing boundaries and disciplines with zero shame whatsoever. And that's one of the reasons why I've always been fascinated with what happens out there. And I guess the focus of the book, I mean, you talk about cities, you talk about companies, and in some ways these things are super organisms. And so it's not surprising that we should start using the tools of biology to understand these phenomenon. But of course, biology itself is rooted in things like physics. And so, I mean, why has it taken so long to see the emergence of what we might think of as a science of scaling, or a science of networks, or a science of complexity? And I guess that presumes that there is such a thing. I mean, you said, I think somewhere in the book, complexity is hard to define, but you know it when you see it. Are we seeing the emergence? Is this new discipline an emergent phenomenon itself? Are we seeing the emergence of a new consilience that brings together all of these disciplines?
Well, first of all, thank you for inviting me to this podcast. I'm delighted, and I look forward to our conversation. And indeed, that's a huge leading question and basic to, I think everything probably we're going to say. In a certain sense, yes, I think there is. I think that in the 21st century, I think this will become, I mean, exactly what we call it and exactly what it encompasses will, evolve. But I do think, just because the nature of the problems we have to face on the planet, a science of complex systems, or maybe more precisely complex adaptive systems that are not just complex but are evolving and changing and subject to all kinds of strange externalities, will begin to be formulated in some form or another. And the Santa Fe Institute was basically set up to try to initiate that. And in that, it has become, so to speak, the hub, the international hub for an attempt to put together something that we could call a science of complexity. You also asked why it took so long, and I think that's an interesting question of itself. And it might be, and this may be, my physics-centered viewpoint, it may be because physics itself was so successful. Physics, of course, is the field of the. So, well, obviously by definition, almost the physical universe, but it also could be thought of, if you think of complexity, as the science of the simplicity of, the things that are subject to being able to write down well-defined principles, have well-defined equations, and have a kind of pretty structured paradigm for how to attack problems, to think about problems. And, the success is extraordinary. I mean, not just in its the kind of residue that it's produced in terms of the technology. We're using it right now. I mean, it's kind of amazing in a way, but all of that, of course, derives from understanding the physical world and the fundamental laws. But also perhaps even more extraordinary is, sort of in a very coarse-grained way, we understand, the beginnings of the universe and the evolution of the universe from the Big Bang to the formation of galaxies to planets and and all of this, and it's kind of amazing. And I was just the other day, I had to put together a lecture, and I was sort of thinking about some of these things, and I gave an example of the magnetic moment of the electron. So that's the strength of the electron is a little magnet. And how big is that magnet? Well, the theory allows you to calculate that to 13 decimal places. Which is an extraordinary tour de force of itself. What is also amazing, another tour de force, is that the experiment has been done to 13 decimal places, and they agree. And 1 part in 10 to the 13th, I did this little calculation, is like measuring the distance from Los Angeles to New York to much, much less than a hair's breadth. So, this is extraordinarily powerful, and that success sort of overwhelms, gives you this sort of powerful feeling. And somehow the idea that all this messiness that's around us, I'm looking out of a window here across Los Angeles, actually, believe it or not, and there's plants and trees and, buildings and people, and there's probably crime going on, and there's money being made, all this junk. But there's the feeling that, actually, all we got to do is keep turning the crank and we can sort of understand all that. And sort of that was a sort of view that was implicitly held, certainly by physicists, the arrogance of physicists. And what we learned towards the end of the 20th century, that was a totally naive and arrogant, stupid view. That in fact, there are these, and you've already used the word, emergent laws that, are certainly connected to what's underneath, but, are also, once they're there, are sort of disconnected. You don't, in order to understand life, you almost certainly don't have to know about quarks and gluons and string theory and, the rest of that stuff. Or to understand, the traffic here around me, or what the future of the United States economy is. You don't have to understand any fundamental physics, in that sense. And so a whole new, that's why we have these new sciences. But somehow there was this feeling that if you really were very smart, you could derive everything. And that was a totally naive view. And so I think, as I say, beginning in the 80s, 70s, 80s, people started to think more about maybe we should just think about the big picture and maybe different kinds of principles that transcend this, I'll call it messiness, the complexity of the different forms of life we have to confront and participate in on the planet.
Well, it seems like it's not just that you don't need to understand those things to explain it, but that it's inadequate, right? That those rules need to be supplemented with some new perspectives. And I think you said, by the way, economics has long had physics envy. Within the economics departments, we've always talked about that, about how physics envy has gotten in the way of certain types of developments in the world of theory. And you mentioned that when you met biologists, because biologists, they seem to be exempt from this to some degree, when you met people who put Darwin above Einstein and Newton, you were a bit surprised. You're, wait, hold on a second, what? There's somebody above. And so biology seems to have not, suffered from this physics envy.
They actually do talk about it as well, actually. But I think there is a big difference. It certainly has not invaded, if that's the right word, I'm not sure it is, biology the way it has economics. In fact, it was only, when I started to learn about economics, when I got involved with the Santa Fe Institute, I had not appreciated how much of economic theory was sort of mimicking physics. which made it easier in a certain sense for me to understand. On the other hand, it seemed again, I mean, even though I hadn't yet been converted into this new way of thinking, so to speak, I was rather surprised at and thought it was naive. And indeed, one of the things I'm very critical of now is that part of economics, which is highly mathematical and sort of, if you like, inspired by physics, seems to be, one of the things it hasn't done that physics is quite, feels very strong, physicists feel very strongly about, is tie it to data, is to be inspired by data to begin with. That is, you don't sort of, it's very rare in physics, it has of course happened, that you have principles and then you look at the data and they do experiments. It's almost entirely, quote, the scientific method is usually from observation and experiment, then you do principles, and then it's an iterative process. And one of the things that I found lacking in economics, which surprised me, was that kind of iterative process. It seemed to have become enamored with formalism. And I say that curiously because I'm a theoretical physicist and, I do formal theory often. But it is inspired, my work, I think throughout my career, has been almost always inspired by observation and experiment, and and that ties everything down, and that's what makes it powerful in the end.
Now, there is one area of economics that helps one to understand this book quite well, and that is this idea of scaling, right? So we talk, in fact, just this morning in my class, right, I was talking about economies of scale and diseconomies of scale, right, which is superlinear and sublinear scaling, to use the
I use a different language.
Yeah. But that's, I think economists, they're always trying to understand that. And always looking to see whether or not expanding a production line, expanding the size of an organization, expanding a production run, is going to lead to lower costs or higher costs. And we have some theories about when you would expect to find one and when you would expect to find the other, but it's always surprising how often we get these things wrong. One of my examples, this is not from economics, but I use this example, the example of Tusco, in my data and decisions course.
In my book, yes, Tusco the elephant.
Yeah.
Yes.
And this, I love this whole story about why Superman or Godzilla, right, don't make sense and could never exist. I
enjoyed talking about those. I must say, I have to say, it sounds immodest of myself, but I was quite proud of myself to come up with these rather simple examples, but which I think are quite powerful, actually, in illustrating the point.
Right. And so you also introduce this concept of metabolism, and I think metabolism is a concept from biology, but you apply it in a lot of different ways. So I was wondering if you could maybe start with this key idea that these systems are all about filling space, right, with the invariance of terminal units that minimize energy. When I saw that description of these systems and how you were able to apply it in so many domains, I was fascinated.
Yeah, so I got into this because there were these extraordinary scaling laws in biology, and they're extraordinary basically because they exist. Because in a way, the image of biology, and this you could also extrapolate to societies, economic systems, cities, companies. The thinking, especially in biology, because of Darwin, is the focus is on diversity, the differences between things. because that's when you look around the biosphere. The diversity and complexity is to a large degree overwhelming. And what was discovered, and you already mentioned the name of Kleiber early on, Max Kleiber, was the man who systematically looked at how metabolic rate, which is sort of the most fundamental quantity of biology, maybe of any complex system for that matter, that is how much energy do you need, per second or per day to sustain the system. So the food, how much food, roughly speaking, does an organism need? How does that scale with the size of the system? And he discovered that it increases mathematically as a power law.
So it's nonlinear, basically.
It's non-linear. It's highly non-linear, which is surprising of itself. First of all, it's surprising that there's a scaling law, as I say, because each organism has its own unique history. We think of its individuality. It has its historically contingent. Each organ, each cell type is historically contingent. So, if you were to plot metabolic rate versus size, you would see just a huge spread, just enormous spread, each organism reflecting some unique historical evolutionary trajectory. And what he discovered was quite the contrary, that if you plotted logarithmically, that is going up by factors of 10 on each scale, then the metabolic rate of these organisms all lay on the same line, on one simple line, and the slope of that line was 3/4, meaning it's non-linear, and also 3/4 being less than 1, it designated as sublinear. And sort of in English, that just meant
there's diseconomies of scale.
There's diseconomies of scale in economics language, exactly. And so, the bigger you are, you save, so to speak, energy, the use of energy, as you increase size in a systematic way governed by this very simple law with this curious number 3/4. And he discovered that in the early 1930s. And subsequent to that, there was, people looked at the scaling of almost any physiological quantity that you could imagine, that you could measure, like everything from, heart rates to lengths of aortas to diffusion rates of oxygen across membranes and so on, and every life history event, like how long do you live, how long do you take to mature. And all of them looked like these metabolic rate graphs, that is plotted logarithmically. They were straight lines, and their slopes were simple multiples of 1/4. And so what emerged from that was this number 4 sort of dominated biology, dominated the biosphere. And this is now my surprise. My surprise is that remained a mystery from, beginning with the 30s with Kleiber, but up through the 40s and 50s when a lot of the data was collected. And then it went underground because of the molecular revolution and the discovery of the structure of DNA, the role and structure of DNA. And so everything shifted to genomics and molecular stuff. And this big picture kind of way of looking at things, which had been more traditional, sort of went onto the back burner. And what was surprising is that there was no explanation. Where in the hell did this number come from? And why did they scale like that? And that's what got me involved in trying to think about it, and working with a couple of biologists. One was a very distinguished biologist named Jim Brown. Another was his student, Brian Enquist, who is himself now very well established. We claimed to have found the solution to that. We had a theory that was, now we go to really answering your question, that we said.
No, but it's interesting because that's an example of where, there's an observation that comes first.
Exactly.
But nobody really understood why there was this pattern. That the explanation had to come later.
That's right. That's why I went through that whole palaver there about it, because that's the way I think physics and I think good science proceeds, is from observation and then looking for generalities or looking for systematic behavior, and then asking, where in the hell did that come from? What is it what are the principles and how can I derive it? I mean, in physics, mathematically, so biology had done this work, but no one had derived it. I mean, it was kind of weird, actually. I thought. I was very surprised. But it was really because, I say, the molecular revolution. I mean, many of the most famous biologists had been fascinated by this in the, early on. But so the idea was that we enunciated was that the commonality across, and by the way, this was true across the entire biosphere. It wasn't just sort of mammals. It was mammals, fish, birds, crustacea, plants and trees, things that are completely different, superficially anyway. But the thing they have in common is they all have to do the same thing. Namely, they all have to use energy, metabolize it, and send it to the cells in order to be sustained. And how do they send it to cells? Well, it's sort of obvious. They develop networks. So the idea was the commonality is networks, and the hypothesis was the reason these scaling laws have evolved is because of the universality and generality of the networks that dominate life.
And so with the body, it's the capillary networks, right?
That's right. That's right. The
circulatory system.
But it's all those systems. It's also the respiratory system, the one, breathing through our lungs. But those kinds of systems all have similar mathematics, is the idea, with similar principles. And the principles were the ones that you quickly enunciated 10 minutes ago, namely the idea was that, and by the way, these principles, since these laws, these phenomenological laws transcended the sort of evolved engineering of the system. That is, we're not plants, we're not trees, but we sort of have the same law. So it has to transcend the design. So it must be very non-specific. So we enunciated ones that weren't. And one of them, the first one was that the terminal units, what we call the terminal units of the network, the capillaries of the circulatory system, if you're familiar with it, the alveoli, for example, of the lungs, these are invariant in the sense that they don't change as you go from one species to another, because natural selection, when it evolved a new species, did not start from scratch. It used the basic building blocks like capillaries and cells and so on to build up. And the thing that distinguishes you from a whale is, in this context, is we have the same capillaries, but the network is so much bigger.
Yeah, and the aorta is probably like a foot wide in the whale, right?
Yeah, I forget what I said. I forget what it is. It's 10 feet. I mean, ours is pictures is about 1.5 inches.
And the hummingbird's is like that, right?
And theirs is yes, that's right. I mean, a shrew you can barely see. It's less than 1 millimeter, and but the whale is like you could drive a car through it, and but down at the capillary end, at the other end of the network, they're the same. So that's the idea, because you build up, use those as building blocks. So that was the first. The second was one that you mentioned, space filling, which is simply a fancy way of saying, look, the network has to service all of the cells in the body. So it has to go everywhere that you define the organism to be. And the last that we enunciated, which is the most important, really, and the most radical in a certain way, is that of this kind of infinitude of networks that are space-filling and have this invariant terminal unit, the ones that have evolved are the ones that have optimized the system by minimizing the amount of energy. For example, in the circulatory system, your heart has to do to pump blood through your circulatory system to supply oxygen to the cells so you can live. And you minimize it, and here was the crucial thing, as with the others, you minimize it so as to maximize your so-called Darwinian fitness. That is, you want to minimize the amount of energy that you have to use for the mundane purposes of staying alive, so to speak, in order to maximize the amount of energy you can devote to reproduction and rearing of offspring. And, that's just Darwinian fitness. So to have your children and grandchildren take the genes forward. So that's it. So you minimize that. And so the reason that's so powerful is that all of physics, people outside of physics, I don't think quite appreciate it. All of physics is derivable from optimization principles. All the fundamental laws that you're familiar with from, relativity and quantum mechanics and Maxwell's equations of electricity and magnetism, all are actually derivable from optimizing something we call action, but it's an optimization. And so, in the big picture, physicists tend to think in terms of optimized systems. And by the way, I think that's one of the things some mathematical economists picked up on in terms of the economy moving towards optimization and that kind of idealized way of thinking about economics.
Well, I remember
the whole idea is those principles, what is amazing is when you mathematize those things I said, invariance of terminal units, space filling, and this minimization of energy dissipated by the system. Amazingly, when you have to write all the equations, it takes a very long time. It's complicated, but it's doable. You can solve all the equations and out pop all these scaling laws, all of them.
And so I think
the quarter power, and the origin of the quarter power.
You mentioned that all the animals have the same blood pressure, which was kind of
yes.
mind-boggling.
So one of the things, so that was one of the things that was so surprising. I remember when I did this work and I calculated the blood pressure, and I said, "Oh my God!" I was going to use an expletive now, but I'm not. I really screwed up because the blood pressure has to be, according to my theory here, blood pressure has to be the same, which I said is nuts. How can the blood pressure in a whale, which has an aorta of 10 feet,
it's probably kind of hard to put that band around
the... how can they sustain the same pressure? It doesn't make any sense, I thought. And I couldn't believe it when I looked it up. It's true. They have the same, on the average, the same blood pressure. Mammals have the same blood pressure from the shrew, which is for those not familiar, a small little rodent that sits on the palm of your hand. It's to a whale, which is bigger than this building I'm in. So it's kind of amazing, actually. So that was a very satisfying moment to realize that the theory had actually produced a result that seemed nuts, which was actually correct.
I think there's another thing where every mammal has more or less the same number of heartbeats in a lifetime.
Yeah.
That's another thing.
That also. So there were these what we call invariants in physics. That's one of them, is the blood pressure. But also that if you can use this to derive a theory of aging and mortality, and out of that pops this also curious thing that was known. And I knew this one I did know before I did the calculation. And that is, roughly speaking, on the average, the number of heartbeats in a lifespan is about the same for, again, the shrew, which lives for about a year and a half or two, maybe at max, and a whale that can live 125 years. And they, so that shrew, which is beating at over 1,000 times a minute, boom, 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 and a whale which goes boom, boom, boom. That cadence between the two is such that if you count that number over their lifespan, is roughly speaking the same. It's about 1.5 billion.
Yeah, I remember I used to teach a course called Economics and Biology about 25 years ago. And
my gosh, that's interesting.
One one of the books that I used was called Optima for Animals, and I can't remember who the author was, but
Oh, that
it
would be
basically,
interesting. I don't know. I wonder. Oh, that would be interesting. If you ever,
yeah,
if you can dig it up, I'd be very interested actually
yeah,
what they had
and
to say.
it just walked through some very simple things like, okay, bone density, right? So
Yeah,
the lower it is, the more likely it is that the bone will break, but then the denser it is, the more it can support weight and so forth. And so there's going to be a sweet spot or trade-off. And I
yeah,
just walked through like a dozen
exactly.
simple examples about how evolution kind of took you to the peak of
No,
that
yeah,
fitness
absolutely,
curve. Yeah, but that
absolutely.
explains sort of why Godzilla can't happen, or Superman. So I guess
No,
Godzilla would just sort of, I mean, it would be is its limbs would get gangrene, it would topple over, right?
well, I
Um,
thought what I said in the book. Yeah, I did all the calculations. I tell you what happened there. They made I don't know when it was, 5 to 10 years ago. They made this new film of Godzilla, a Hollywood version, and I got called up by one of the one of the magazines, maybe Popular Mechanics even, I forget, who said, we're making it, and someone asked the question, about its scaling. I mean, that is, could it exist and what all the rest, and could you tell us a little bit about it? So that got me. So I sat down and did some of the calculations and so on, and realized that, which I knew anyway. Because, by the way, the thing about that, of course, is that the most fundamental thing is that about Godzilla is it can't support itself
mhm,
on land. I mean, that's why we have whales have to be in the ocean.
mhm.
I mean, that's the fantastic thing that evolution did. It, eventually, if the drive is towards bigger, then the only way you get bigger mammals or bigger land animals is to go into the ocean and relieve yourself of gravity. And Godzilla didn't do that, so he couldn't exist. In fact, Galileo had already realized that, 450 years ago. And so I just elaborated a lot on that, and I did all kinds of little I even calculated the amount of urine it produced per day, which was kind of a swimming pool's worth. It was kind of amusing doing these calculations.
Well, another interesting thing that flows from this theory is like bonsai trees, right? When you look at bonsai trees, you expect the leaves to be smaller, but they're not.
No,
The
they're
same
not.
size
No,
as.
very roughly. Yeah, I mean, one of the things so I should have said that when I said about the invariance of terminal units, because a leaf can be thought of as a terminal unit of the branches. And, when you think about it, and it was something I'd never actually thought about before I did this work, that exactly what you just said, the leaves of trees do vary, of course, but they don't vary when you think of going from a small little shoot, a little tree that's just
Mhm.
growing, and you see the leaves come out, all the way to giant trees. The leaves are roughly the same. They don't the leaves don't grow bigger. And I realized that when I started to work on cities, the same principle is that if you go from, the house you live in to the Empire State Building, the terminal units of your electrical system, namely the plugs in the wall, don't scale with the size of the building. You'd
Yeah,
have you don't have 10 foot by 10 foot plugs in your in your room. You have exactly the same plug that you do, the same outlet in your house as you do in the tallest building in the world.
right.
And
And
it's the
also
same
for
idea.
now, you talk about some of the predecessors, some of the people who were thinking about these ideas. You mentioned this guy Darcy Wentworth Thompson. I mean, there are a whole
Oh,
bunch of
yes, the
people
Greek
that
gospel.
yeah, a whole bunch of people that I learned about in this book that I had not known about.
Yeah,
Um, and so there was like I guess this attention to scaling. It was an
sure.
issue, right? It was something that people were thinking about at one point,
Absolutely.
and then they kind of
Absolutely. Well, as I said a moment ago, at the very beginnings of modern science, which I consider to be Galileo, in his fantastic book called The Dialogues Concerning the Two New Sciences, where he was the one that started the whole idea of, sort of beginning of Newton's laws. One of the discussions he has is about scale. He asks the question, why isn't it that we can't have sort of infinitely tall trees or infinitely tall buildings? I mean, what's limiting us? And he quickly realized that there was a very simple scaling argument, that as you scale up a building, say, the beams holding up the building, the strength of those beams are only proportional to the cross-sectional area of the beam. That's why we say, 2x4s, 2x2s, and so on. That's the cross-sectional area, which goes like a length squared. But the thing that it's holding up is the whole weight, the whole volume, and that goes like a length cubed, and a length cubed eventually beats a length squared. And so you've got to make some changes. So if you don't change materials or design, you're going to collapse under your own weight. And he makes that very clear, and it's a lovely argument. Actually, it's extremely articulately presented, and Thomson, and so it goes back to the beginnings. And Darcy Thompson, who you mentioned, was a real polymath. He was a Scottish. Actually, I think he might have been trained as a classicist. But he was also trained as a mathematician, and then he moved into biology, became a very famous biologist, and he wrote a very famous book, one of the great books of science, called On Growth and Form. And in that, the book is, a large part of it is devoted to some of these mechanical questions of scale, like the ones like Galileo and so on, and of design. And one of the nice things, I think one of the reasons Darcy Thompson is still read is, first of all, it's extremely well written, but it's very philosophical. He talks about the philosophy of science, how to do science and the nature of science, and how far can you push mathematical explanations of things, can you ever understand consciousness mathematically, and so on. And it's a lovely book. And well, it's a book. It's 2 fat volumes. You can't, but it's so it's been a theme for a long time, but it's never been sort of formalized. And that's what surprised me when I got into it. And it's sort of interesting that, to my own surprise, our work sort of created this sort of mini subfield of scaling in biology, and now scaling in cities and companies and so on. It's sort of people have realized that it's a wonderful window in order to start thinking about things. I mean, it's not of itself, but it reveals all kinds of underlying phenomena, underlying principles, and so forth.
Well, let's switch to cities, because, I mean, you talk about how some aspects of the cities are superlinear and some are sublinear. Why don't these superorganisms kind of peter out, right? At some point to get to a certain size and they stop? I mean, it seems to be true New York City has kind of flattened at 8 million people. It's been that way for a long time, but we see other cities just continue to grow and grow. So what is it about cities that makes them like organisms, and what is it that makes them unlike organisms?
That's a really good question, and one that I really enjoyed thinking about throughout this work as we move the work from biology into cities. And it was sort of an obvious move because since the theoretical framework was one of networks, that it was networks actually that were underlying this systematic behavior. Cities are obviously network systems. So it was very natural to start to think about cities in this way. And so in order to answer your question, let me just go back first to biology and ask the opposite question. Why is it that, why do we stop growing? After all, you eat, you metabolize, and you keep growing. and then sort of, when you're in your teens, you stop, and yet you still go on eating. You grow. You don't. I mean, you may put on some weight and so on, but you don't grow so-called ontogenetically. You're pretty much the same. You reach pretty much a stable configuration, and then you die. And the theory actually explains all of that, in that the growth is because of the sublinear behavior of metabolic rate, meaning if that's the supply side, so it's as the system is growing, the supply per unit mass of tissue that it's supplying decreases. I mean, because it's decreasing systematically. On the other hand, you're trying to add mass kind of in a linear way, and so the demand, if that's the demand to grow, the supply can't keep up with it, because it's only going as the 3/4 power. It's only increasing with this 3/4 rate, and the demand is sort of going linear, and linear will always beat it. So you stop, and you can put that into a mathematical framework, and you get these lovely predictions for growth curves. Kind of classic so-called sigmoidal growth, where you grow quickly at the beginning and then you taper off and asymptote to an approximately stable state. And by the way, that stability in individual growth plays a really crucial role in the long-term sustainability of the biosphere. I mean, because most of the time, for most not all organisms, most organisms, we're in a roughly sort of a metastable configuration. And so, so that's allowed the system to have this sort of, it's been around for 2 or 3 billion years, and part of it is related to this stable growth. Now, in cities, there's a piece of a city, a major piece. In fact, when you think of cities, the major part of a city you think about is sort of biological, namely it's all its infrastructure, it's all its physicality, its buildings. And except
it's also
the
circulation of people, right, in and out of the
circulation,
city center.
I mean, all the transport and the electrical
sewage,
lines and the water,
plumbing.
Yeah, all of that stuff
Yeah.
is very analogous to biology. I mean, quite analogous to biology. And indeed, and you could argue that cities have evolved sort of towards trying to optimize that in some way, approximate optimization. And so, you're not surprised, given the biology, that in terms of its infrastructure, cities would also satisfy similar scaling laws. And in fact, they do. That's one of the things we discovered, that if you look at all the physical quantities, the transport of people and materials and so on, all of these things scale in a sublinear way. The only difference is it's instead of 0.75, for most things, it's 0.85. So that's a whole nother question, why it's 15%, not 25%, but we can talk about that in a minute. But
there was that one observation you said, I forget who it was, that said that it's a constant, how much time people spend commuting, or how much time people spend traveling.
So that's
it seems to be the same, no matter where you go.
No, exactly. So that was the idea, that really what's dominating, in a certain sense, in terms of that optimization idea, is that the city has evolved so that sort of on the average, you want to minimize the time to get from A to B. Now, you may do zigzag and so on, but you don't, when you go home from the office, you don't sort of head in some arbitrary direction. You go, roughly speaking, the fastest way. Now, there may be an economic component, maybe, there's something cheaper that you might do, but on the average, you try to go the fastest way to wherever you want to go, to the store, to take the kids to school, go to the theater, whatever. So, and that is sort of the dominant, that kind of thinking is the dominant thinking for giving rise to scaling laws in cities for the infrastructure. Now, of course, that infrastructure, and I must say, when I first started this work, I thought cities are probably quite boring. And then I began to realize that, of course, quite the opposite. They're sort of they're almost fundamental to social life on the planet, socioeconomic life on the planet, and are critically important, and of course are now critically important for the long-term sustainability of the planet. But I also didn't realize, in my naivete, that the whole point of a city is to facilitate social interaction, is to, facilitate people to interact so they innovate, create ideas, create wealth, and so on. I mean, that's
This
sort
is
of
Mumford's point.
that's what we've evolved to do.
This is Mumford's point,
And
right?
sorry?
This is Lewis
I'm
Mumford's
sorry.
point, right?
Yes, Lewis Mumford. Yes, and funnily enough, having said that, it must have been, I read Lewis Mumford when I was an undergraduate because, somehow, I don't know, someone had told me he was a very interesting writer on cities, and I'd read some of his work and completely forgotten it, but it must have stayed at some unconscious level that popped up when I started doing this work. And then someone told me about Jane Jacobs, whom I'm embarrassed to say I'd never heard of, and then became a great hero of mine when I read her book. And I realized that this woman who did everything you shouldn't do, namely extrapolate from one example, totally anti-science, extrapolate from one example and make these extraordinary generalizations, but extraordinarily she got everything right. So anyway, and that was also that whole thing that the cities are for people. It's sort of an obvious thing, but most of us don't, most people don't see cities that way, to my surprise. And I certainly didn't. But facilitating this social interaction. And so therefore, the other thing that's at play, and in fact is dominant in a city, is social networks, is the network, the interaction between people. And those are quite different from the networks we've been talking about, because those, the fundamental structure of a social network is that A talks to B, B talks to C, C talks back to A, and we build on each other. We keep building on these ideas. Effectively, they may be stupid ideas and they may be wrong, and no one gives a damn about any of them, and we forget them afterwards. So in almost all cases, it's sort of irrelevant. On the other hand, the thing that's extraordinary about that is that dynamic is what produces a theory of relativity or a Google or a Microsoft or, where are you, UC Berkeley or whatever, it produces, that's what it does.
These are agglomeration economies. That's what economists would call it.
Exactly. So these are the classic agglomeration effects of what a city does. And this is just putting it into a network language, that it's the interaction within these networks and the structure of those networks. And so the idea is, so what you realize is that instead of having an economy of scale, which we had in biology and the physical part of a city, that is, you're trying to minimize something. For the social part, you're doing exactly the opposite. You want to maximize interaction. And so we have this positive feedback that's continually taking place. And that positive feedback, instead of giving an economy of scale, namely the bigger you are, the less per capita, means that the bigger you are, the more per capita. So the bigger you are, the more interactions per capita, therefore the more ideas per capita, therefore the more socioeconomic activity per capita, therefore, higher wages per capita, more opportunities per capita, but also, more disease per capita, more crime per capita, because that's all social interaction. And so, as I usually say, the good, bad, and ugly all come together. And that's what we discovered when we looked at the data of scaling laws for all these socioeconomic metrics as a function of city size. Again, when you plot them in this logarithmic way, we saw very nice scaling. And instead of being sublinear, they were superlinear, and they were superlinear to the extent that the slopes. That was the other thing. They were superlinear. They had a common slope of about 1.15 for all these different metrics, and that was, from our viewpoint, was because they're all derived from the same thing in principle, and that is social interaction. And then you can extrapolate that idea to saying, well, social interactions in the United States aren't so different from those in France or Argentina, because they're all pretty much the same human beings, roughly. So you expect the same kind of scaling laws. So you see the same scaling laws across urban systems across the globe, roughly speaking. And that was what we found, was this sort of universality of scaling laws for both infrastructure and for the socioeconomic activity. And the last piece of it is that if you now feed this into the idea about growth, things change, because the reason you stopped growing was that the supply was sublinear and couldn't keep up with the demand. Now you have superlinear, and you're producing more. As the bigger you get more and more, and you're completely outpacing the demand, so you just keep growing. So that's the idea. And then you can put that into the mathematics, and indeed you get that, and that was great. That was, it reproduces the growth curve of cities and of the planet for that.
But how does that explain the sort of life and death of cities, to kind of use Jane Jacobs' language? Because you point out that cities live longer. I mean, they have a tendency to last, for a pretty long time.
In fact, I would say,
and even, I mean, one would think that you talk about metabolism, one would think that the higher the metabolism, the more quickly it would kind of burn out, like a shrew or a hummingbird, right? The New York and the London, they should be dead, and maybe the St. Louis the Detroit should still be alive. I don't know.
No, I think that's a very interesting question, because the reason that, as you say, that organisms die, which we haven't talked about, is because the metabolism, in physics terms, produces entropy. That is, it produces wear and tear. I mean, every time you transform energy, you produce entropy, and entropy is a reflection of what we call dissipation, meaning wearing and tearing. And here's the point, so that would certainly lead to decay and aging and ultimately mortality. But there's one other piece, and that is, of course, that you repair. So it depends actually on how much energy you want to allocate to repair. And even as Darwin realized early on, evolution can only work if people die. People have to die. And so that's what's happened. I mean, we have evolved so that enough repair is done so that a human being can live to about age 40, produce 10 to 15 children, and then die. And then evolution doesn't care. And so everybody before the 20th century certainly died. Most people died before they were 45 years old. Actually, before they were 40. So now you go forward to the cities. You're absolutely right that you're producing this metabolism. If you think of it as social metabolism, it's a slightly different kind of metabolism, of course, because it's social interaction as well as physical. And the question is, what is the friction that's causing damage in social interaction, which is not entirely clear. I don't know the answer to that, by the way. I don't know quite what that means, taking that metaphor. But what we do is, in order to keep the system going, we allocate a huge amount to overcoming the entropy. I mean, we're continually repairing and replacing and so on. I mean, we put that excess energy, that excess that we don't need to respond to the demand for new growth, we put into repair. And we're continually doing that, I mean, all the time. And, it could have been that we don't do that. I mean, then, of course, you would have what you say, everything would decay, but we haven't. We put it in so that we have this open-ended growth. So much so that, as an economist, you know much better than I, that is the fundamental paradigm, certainly since the Industrial Revolution and the discovery of entrepreneurship and capitalism, all this marvelous stuff that's led to this extraordinary life that we're privileged to lead. That's that's what we've done, and it's kind of amazing. But there is a catch, and we can talk about that, which is to do with the singularity.
Well, one of the fun facts you highlighted was that people walk faster in bigger cities. I remember when I moved from Philadelphia to Durham, North Carolina, and the first thing that I noticed when I was walking through the Duke campus is that I was just walking past everybody, and it took me a while to it took me a while to kind of.
That's funny. It's so interesting, that experience, because so it's funny that when we did this work, we realized that, and I didn't say this as we were talking, this positive feedback, superlinear kind of behavior, giving rise to more social interactions, more ideas, and so on, also leads to the increasing pace of life in a systematic, quote, predictable way, as distinct from biology, where that economy of scale leads to slowing of the pace of life. Everything slows down the bigger you are, and you live longer, everything takes longer. We've said it basically with the heart rates of the shrew versus the elephant. Here we have the opposite. If the shrew is Santa Fe, where I live, and the elephant is New York, I mean, it's ridiculous, the difference in sort of pace of life. And your experience, I've had the opposite one, having lived in Santa Fe a long time, and I go to a big city, and especially if I go to New York. And I remember the first time I did this, this work, where we thought maybe this is part of the the consequences of the increasing pace of life. Walking down Fifth Avenue, and it was around Christmas time actually, so it was particularly hectic. And I just realized everybody's zooming along, and then and I was really sort of I'd gotten used to casually walking, and so that was kind of interesting. But the point is, I mean, already we had my colleagues had discovered that in the 70s or in 80s, people at Princeton, I guess it was, had measured the pace of walking, and indeed it was increasing, sort of consistent with this idea.
Well, we need to talk about companies. This is really where I spend my time, and companies seem to be curious. They seem to sit somewhere between cities and organisms in a way. I mean, they do experience a lot of this kind of super linear scaling. Bigger companies, more ideas, more interactions, and so forth. But at some point, they kind of get too big. I mean, you can talk about the Soviet Union, right? It was a really big company, and it didn't work so well. And so, what would be the equivalent of what is it that is circulating there? Is it information? How should we be thinking about that? And then also, why is it that companies do die more quickly than cities? One would think that they also would want to invest in repair and maintenance and extend their lives.
Yes. So, in fact, what originally, when I was doing the biology and thinking of extending it to cities and companies, actually, I wanted to send it to companies first and then cities. But one of the big issues in this work is getting hold of good data, credible data, good data.
You had to get the CompuStat data. They wouldn't give it to you.
So exactly. So, what I discovered, in fact, I think the first proposal we wrote was for cities. And then I learned that, to get data, you had to buy it. And we didn't have any money. We didn't have the money at that stage. We weren't funded to do this. And I forget what it was, what seemed at the time humongous amount. So we turned to cities first, because that you can get, that's for free, basically. I mean, you could get hold of that, but companies not. So, but the question that intrigued me was the one that you've raised, was why is it that cities persist, they don't die. I mean, of course, we know of cities that have died, but, overwhelmingly, cities don't die. You can, as I say, and I may have said in the book, I forget, you can drop an atom bomb on a city, and 25 years later, it's functioning fine. And that's, and all you have to do is wiggle the stock market a little bit, and you lose TWA. I mean, it's sort of like, companies are fragile and cities are incredibly robust. And why is that? They're both social organizations. They have some similarities. They have obvious differences. But so that was when I started the work. I started to get. That was always at the back of my mind. That question, exactly the one you've asked. So the first thing that we did with that was when we did get the CompuStat data, which was to see that the companies scaled. And I think when we first did it, and I think it's in the book, we plotted the data. We used the number of employees as the size as the metric, the proxy for the size of the company. Since then, which is not published, I think, is using assets. We decided assets was a better metric. Doesn't make a hell of a lot of difference, but anyway, that's a detail in this. But we did see very good evidence of scaling, but not surprisingly with much more variance. I mean, after all, if you look at the biology and you look at most of the scaling curves, they're, the points lie very close to the scaling line. Cities, there's some variance, there's much more variance, but it's still pretty good. Companies, it's much broader, much bigger band of variance. Not surprisingly, because animals have evolved over hundreds of thousands to hundreds of millions of years. Mm-hmm. Cities for, hundreds of years to maybe a few thousand, possibly. And companies are tens of years, if you're lucky, in some cases. So it's not surprising that you get tremendous variance. So if you believe that the scaling laws are possibly, are a reflection of a tendency towards optimizing something to be decided, it's not surprising that there'll be a lot of variance, because if you haven't been around very long, everything's still sort of evolving and adapting. Okay, so we did learn that mostly companies. Oh, there were something else about companies that I only realized later, which played a very important role, was the role of liability that distinguishes them significantly from everything else. I mean, it probably is unique in the universe, I suspect, companies. There's probably the only thing in the universe that borrows from the future. I mean, I have to say it, not being an economist, at first, I knew about, obviously I know about liability, I have a mortgage. But I hadn't realized how profound and extraordinary that is. When you think of it in the big picture, that you have this system that can take something from the future and sustain itself and grow itself by borrowing from that. That is an amazing. Anyway, we realized. That's. So I'm sorry, my naivete at not appreciating the power of that.
But that's the kind of discovery. Like you're surrounded by something your whole life, and then you see it through a new lens, and it pops.
Absolutely.
Right?
No, exactly. It's one of those wonderful things about, when you're an academic, especially in research, where you've known something, and then, you must get it when you teach. Usually when I teach, you've taught something, you know something, and then you're teaching, and one day you're teaching it, and it's like, oh my God, now I get it. You sort of get, just realize. And it was a bit like that. So I'm sorry, this is a tangential remark, but it was very important. Understand the role of liability. So what we learned was that most metrics are sort of sublinear, and liability is linear. Liability is one of the few. It's bizarre. It's almost exactly linear. Anyway, we put together a theory that, based on this, a similar sort of mimicking what was done in biology and in cities. And as you said, it's the company is some weird, I don't know if hybrid is the right word. It's somewhere in between cities and biology and organisms. And here was the problem, though. The great thing about cities and studying cities, and even more so about biology, is there's an enormous amount of data about these networks. I mean, we said this theory is a network-based theory.
Yeah.
And one of the things that allowed this work to go forward, especially in biology, is we know about the circulatory system, and I can make theories of it, and I can test it against the enormous amount of data on circulatory systems, just as one example. To a lesser extent, that's true of cities, but you can't
Use cell phone data, right? So you can use cell phone data.
No, you have cell phone there. In fact, that was great. That has been fantastic in helping about the cities. Yeah. I mean, once I was convinced by my friend Carlo Ratti at MIT that this is a long time ago, that cell phone data was going to be a powerful tool in terms of data and observation about testing the theory. It's been phenomenal. And it's difficult now because when we first did that work, just going back to the cities for a moment, the telephone companies didn't realize, they said, oh, yeah, sure, you can have them. I mean, obviously we would scrub them, we would anonymize, but they didn't care. It was useless data. And then they began to, now, of course, it's big stuff, and so it's very hard to get hold of that data for the uses that we want to. But companies, you can't get them. Now, there are some data, but it's very meager on the scale of what we want. And that is what you would like is the entire network of a company, meaning on the one hand, first of all, the analog to a physical network, which might be their distribution network and so on. But much more important is the social network. Who's actually talking to whom? You'd like all their emails, all their telephone calls, all their tweets, anonymized, so you can put together. And it's funny, if you ask when we've asked companies, because I've interacted with several companies, they send you the organization chart.
Right.
I say that's sort of like, that's sort of useless in a way. Mm-hmm. You want to know who are the real, where are the hubs? Who are the points that are really where the action is?
Now there are people within the companies. So, for instance, Michael Arena, who has written on this, and he's used to be head of HR at GM, and so he would map out this stuff. And I think Ben Weber at MIT has done a bunch of this stuff, right? So if you have the Twitter data, and you have, not Twitter, you have the Slack data and the email data.
Yeah,
and
the
then
Slack data, yes.
There
are some of it.
Yeah, if you have badges, so Ben Weber has having these badges that would track people moving around and talking to each other.
That's right. That's what you need. No, exactly. You need all that. And we didn't have access. We didn't. First of all, we didn't have access to it, and we didn't know how to get it. We didn't have the contacts. I'll tell you. This is again a tangential remark. One of the curious things that's happened since then, since we started working on this and so on, is that I now have had 3 postdocs, 2 coming out of physics, that are young faculty, young professors in business schools. So, which is sort of amazing. One's at Sloan, one's at Kellogg, and one's at whatever that business school is in Barcelona. But 2 of them, the one at Sloan and one at Kellogg, joined me with a physics background and moved into these kinds of areas, working on some of these questions. So we're just at the stage where, this work is still very much a work in progress. We're still trying to track down the kinds of data we would like to have. But it's hindered the development of the work on companies, for sure. On the other hand, the stuff that we get from CompuStat, which are, sales and profits and all the rest, ES&G and all the rest of that stuff, we have those all scale, and you can provide a very nice picture. And what you discover from that, by the way, is that on average, companies don't grow exponentially. I mean, the theory predicts they don't grow exponentially at the beginning. They actually grow as a power law, a different kind of power law than we talked about before, but a power law in time with a very large exponent, like 6, which is sort of almost looks like an exponential to begin with. But then, and here's the thing that's interesting, it was actually very satisfying in a way. It doesn't explain it really, but an exponential always beats a power law. That's mathematically. So if a company is growing as t to the time to the 6th, and the market that it sits in is growing exponentially, it's always eventually not going to be able to keep up and will die. So it was very satisfying that the theory produced that, but it produced it with data that we fed in. So it was sort of a self-consistent argument.
Yeah. Well, it reminds me, so I think it was Jack Welch who said that when the pace of change outside the organization exceeds the space of change inside the organization, then the organization dies.
That's exactly what this says. That's exactly what this theory and the data that went into it now says. So it was very, so that was very satisfying. The other thing that we began to realize, this is now much more in the role of business school kind of thinking, was that, I did a lot of talking with companies. I give talks at corporate events or such gatherings, even at Davos and so on. So I took advantage of all of that to talk to people about companies, and looking at the data that we had, putting all that together, formulated this idea, which I think is not terribly original in the end, is that at the beginning, but I'll put it in the language we've been talking about. At the beginning, when a company is very young, there's this extraordinary, you have lots of ideas, lots of the product space, so to speak, is very big because you don't know quite how the market's going to respond. And you sort of don't care so much about the administration, the bureaucracy, and who's going to sweep the floors. And, you have a much more cavalier attitude, obviously. And then there's an inevitability sets in. Two things set in, of course. One is that the market determines what's successful. So it may, you may have very clever favorite products, but if they don't sell, you don't produce them. So necessarily the dimensionality decreases, kind of generically, and it decreases. And at the same time, if the company, once the company gets to 50 to 100 people, you better have a serious bureaucracy, administration handling things, and you have all kinds of legal requirements, tax laws and HR stuff to deal with. So the bureaucracy inevitably grows and has to grow. And then the company, as it gets more and more successful, so two things happen. Inevitably, dimensionality decreases, typically, in this sense, relative to the size of the company. And bureaucracy inevitably increases, so much so that the company becomes, or the company is the bureaucracy, or vice versa. The bureaucracy is the company, the administration. And the other thing that happens, of course, the standard thing that happens, if times get tough, you fire the innovative part, because the idea being that you can always, when things get good, you can get the research division up again and going, which is the first signs of mortality, as far as I'm concerned. So that's sort of the thing that we put together from the data that we had, and sort of informal interviews of what happens.
Well, the last thing I wanted to talk about was towards the end of the book, you talk about the pace of change, or maybe the metabolism of innovation, and how it keeps getting faster and faster. And I just gave a talk, right? Mentioned Moore's law, and there's a bunch of other laws, quote laws, that seem to be at work here. And when this book was written before generative AI, and you were sort of saying, like, what's the next big thing? And that clearly is consistent. And if you look at the number of parameters that they're using, it just keeps growing like crazy. And so is there a way to connect that pace of innovation to these scaling laws that we've been talking about? I mean, it doesn't seem to.
Absolutely.
So how does it map onto this?
Well, the way I tried to do it was that, as I said, the pace of life increases, first of all, in a systematic way. So therefore, you could argue, and that pace, and that's because of this feedback in social interactions. Therefore, you would naively anyway speculate that the pace of innovation would follow the same kind of law.
So is that like a sign? Is that like the I don't know, the community of scholars, the research community is like a virtual city, and that there are increasing returns to the size of this community of innovators?
Sure. Yes, absolutely. Yes, I think it's quite similar to that. You sort of have this inevitable increase in terms of, associated sort of generally with the pace of life. But the other thing that I got more intrigued by was that this growth curve, this open-ended growth that is predicted from the theory, which comes from the superlinear scaling of the sort of basic metrics, leads to it cannot be sustained in the theory. The theory tells you that it can't be sustained. It says that in some finite time in the future, it's growing so fast that it'll be infinite. So that's crazy. I mean, that obviously can't do. And the theory says what happens. The system it eventually collapses, but it stabilizes. Actually, it turns over, and then eventually collapses. And it's kind of a sophisticated neo-Malthusian argument, which I know is not economists hate. So the question is, how do you avoid that? What's happened that we haven't done that, in fact, in the past? And the idea is that what has happened is that would have happened, but if you'd continued with whatever it was, the major innovation was, we've intervened by having a major paradigm shift. That is, we made another major innovation, and that could have been, that's why we say, there was a Stone Age, there was an Iron Age, there was a Bronze Age. So that's the idea, something, some major innovation that defines the age. Like now we have the computer age, we had the computer age. We've gone beyond it, so we're the internet age. And we might have the chat GPT age, the AI age, or the electric vehicle age, who in the hell knows? So the idea is that we have these major interventions, paradigm shifts, major innovations, and what that does in this picture is reset the clock. You can start over again.
Right. So electrification has diminishing returns, and then antibiotics have diminishing returns, and then each one of these things has diminishing returns until the next.
Returns and would lead to some kind of collapse, and you do something. That's what we've done, and of course that's throughout economic. After all, Malthus was and still is trashed, as were Club of Rome and Paul Ehrlich and all the rest of them were trashed. Rightly so, in my opinion, because they never included really innovation in it. They forgot that that's what we do. That's one of our great attributes. So I thought that was great and so on. And then I realized, unfortunately, this bloody theory says, yes, you can do that, but in fact, all it does is postpone things because you're going to have to do another one. And the bloody theory says you have to do it quicker. You have to do it faster than you did before, following this speeding up of the pace of life. That's what the mathematics says. So you have to do it faster and faster. You have to make these major, not only do you have to innovate, but you have to make major innovations, major paradigm shifts in a systematic way that is in a systematic, accelerating fashion. And I was delighted that there's this guy, this stuff of Kurzweil. You know the stuff I'm talking. This stuff about singularity. What he did, which was very nice. He put together his own. It's a bit in the eyes of the beholder. Which were the major paradigm shifts, and he plotted them, and they fit exactly. This thing predicts exactly the rate at which those paradigm shifts should have happened, and they did happen. And so that was very nice. That's sort of a problem, because if you have to accelerate your rate of innovation, that means that, okay, what did it take? 20 years from computers to, I don't know, it took maybe more, 50 years for what we call mainframe computers to laptops. Laptops to the internet didn't take, took 15 years. And, I don't know, 10 years from laptop. I mean, I'm making up numbers. I don't know the numbers. I've forgotten them. To ChatGPT or whatever. But anyway, the next one's going to have to come faster than the one before. So you make a sort of reductio ad absurdum argument that eventually you're going to have a major innovation like the internet or ChatGPT or whatever you want to call it, sort of every 6 months, which is nuts. So the question is, well, it's sort of obvious that is not sustainable. And the question is, how do you avoid that as a collapse?
Yeah, well, you say at the end of the book that you're trying to, maybe we're at the cusp of a grand unified theory of sustainability, right? And I think this might be the first text in that domain. And I think the last thing, I mean, you say that we have physicists using biology as a metaphor, biologists using economics as a metaphor. I mean, at some point the metaphors become not metaphors anymore, right?
Right. Yes. It starts out as a metaphor. I think that's a really interesting point that you're making. It starts out as a metaphor because it's very natural. I mean, after all, I think even Aristotle compared cities to organisms. It starts out as a metaphor, and often ideas do. You start and then you start trying to take them a little more seriously, putting some flesh on the skeleton, and eventually you realize that, okay, it's not exactly what you thought it was as a metaphor, such as, the city as an organism. The city has much in common with organisms, but it's actually quite different. It has this other whole side, which is to do with socioeconomic interaction. Well, it's sort of obvious a priori, but you have to put that into some substantial framework. And I think then it stands on its own once you get to that stage. But I think science and ideas often do evolve that way, from thinking metaphorically, or at least in some, having images of how things, or analogs. And I think that's very useful.
Well, the word metaphor means to carry over, and I think you're carrying a lot of insight from discipline to discipline. So, Geoffrey, thank you so much for joining me. The book is called Scale. Check it out. We'll talk again soon.
Thank you, Greg. Appreciate it very much. Enjoyed the conversation.
Unsiloed podcast is produced by University FM, elevating the stories of your institution.